I have the pleasure to invite my colleague at the Polonsky Academy, Dr. Vilozny. He will give a paper on some remarks on a pre-Adamic human-like demon. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Nico. In the book of Imaginary Beings, Jorge Luis Borges devotes an entry to the mysterious Nis-Nas, vocalized by Borges as Nas-Nas, to which Gustave Flaubert briefly refers towards the end of La Tentation de Saint-Antoine. In this entry, Borges remarks that Jean-Claude Margolin, who commented on Flaubert's work, wrongly credited him with the invention of this beast. Instead, in his definition of Nas-Nas, Borges relies on the information offered by Edward William Lane in his notes on the introduction of the Arabian Nights. According to this definition, the Arabian Nights of Lane was published in 1839. Yeah? According to this definition in the Arabian Nights, the Nas-Nas is the offspring of a demonical creature divided longitudinally, called Shiq, and a human being. It resembles half a human being, having half a head, half a body, one arm, one leg, with which it hops with much agility. It is to be found in the woods and desert country of Yemen and Hadramaut, and is endowed with speech. One race has its face in the breast and a tail like that of a sheep. Its flesh is sweet and very much sought after. Another variety of Nas-Nas, which has the wings of a bat, inhabits the island of Rayej in the Chinese Sea. Although this definition reflects quite accurately Lane's perception of the Nas-Nas, it fails to refer to Lane's sources, thus leading the reader to wrongly assume that this detailed information derives exclusively from Lane's acquaintance with the Arabian Nights. In fact, Lane bases himself on two early sources, Al-Qazvini, who died in 1283, and Ibn al-Wardi, who died in 1457. The invention of the term or the concept Nas-Nas, however, goes further back. Maria Jesus Viguera, who in her 1974 article on the Nas-Nas as a motif in the Ajaib Marvels genre, provides a detailed survey of the Arabic texts in which the term appears, showed this very clearly. Her survey begins with traditions ascribed to authorities such as Abu Huraira, who died in 678, and Ibn Abbas, who died in 686, and the survey ends with As-Suyuti's Diwan al-Hayawan and Az-Zabibi's renowned dictionary Taj al-Arus, who is Az-Zabidi died in 1791. This means that this dictionary was composed over a millennium after the death of Abu Huraira and Ibn Abbas. Following the presentation of the Arabic sources that refer to the Nas-Nas, Viguera offers a typology of the motif. According to this typology, the Nas-Nas represents either real or fantastic creature. As a real creature, it may be terrestrial or marine, and thus constitutes either a species of an ape or a seal, respectively. As a fantastic creature, the Nas-Nas is an intermediate category between human and animal, representing moral or physical degeneration, which may be the result of 1. Creation in an incomplete state, 2. Man-animal intercourse, 3. Metamorphosis by God as punishment for disobedience. Despite the overall acquaintance with the multiple contexts and diverse meanings of the Nas-Nas in the Arabic literary tradition, Viguera's survey does not refer to the significant role it has had in early Quran commentaries. This could be due to the fact that in these works it has served as a pivotal means in resolving a concrete exegetical difficulty rather than a marvelous motif, the latter being Viguera's primary concern in her article. The present talk aims to highlight this additional dimension of the Nas-Nas by presenting and analyzing the difficulty and the solution provided by the early exegetes. The puzzling difficulty revolves around the Quranic verse, which was mentioned more than once today, in which God informs the angels about his intention to create a successor, in Arabic, Khalifa, on earth. It's Quran 2:30. And I quote, "When your Lord told the angels, I am putting a successor on earth, they said, how can you put someone who will cause damage and bloodshed when we celebrate your praise and proclaim your holiness? But he said, I know things that you do not." The first problem faced by early commentators was the term successor or Khalifa. According to the chronology of the Quranic story, this divine declaration took place prior to and as preparation for the creation of Adam, the first man. The understanding of Khalifa as representative or viceroy, two of the most common suggestions among modern Quran translators, was considered as involving the attribution of divine qualities to a human and was therefore less common. The other common understanding, successor, upon which it is widely agreed among early commentators, resolves this difficulty and leaves open the question of whom the first man was meant to succeed. The angel's reaction to the divine declaration has given commentators several guidelines regarding the identity, or at least the character, of the entity that Adam had to succeed. The angels expressed surprise and disappointment at the fact that God has chosen as successor on earth someone who will cause damage and bloodshed, whereas they celebrate his praise and proclaim his holiness. The fundamental problem to which this reaction gives rise is how the angels arrived at the conclusion that the successor will necessarily be characterized by such negative virtues. The question is whether the angels reacted in this manner since they guessed or assumed that this is how the successor would behave, or whether they had concrete knowledge regarding the successor's future conduct. An angelic assumption or speculation that would question or doubt God's omniscience and decision-making is of course problematic and would put them in the position of arrogant sinners. Indeed, several commentaries describe the situation precisely in these terms, ascribing to a group of angels, not all of them, an act of disobedience towards God. As punishment, these angels were unable to see God, ihtajaba anhum, for 7 years, during which they pleaded for a refuge and atonement until they were restored to his grace. As will become clear in what follows, this point of view is of little relevance to our discussion. On the other hand, if the angels base their reaction on knowledge, was it knowledge of the future that was conveyed to them by God or another divine source, or alternatively, was it based on historical evidence and experience? God's reply that he knows things which the angels are unaware of which the angels are unaware, excludes the possibility that the angels based their reaction on previous knowledge that God had revealed to them. It is in the latter case, namely, that the angels based their reaction on empiric knowledge, that the Nasnas enters the story. The point of departure for commentators who understood the term Khalifa as successor must have been that for the angels, this concept, and even more so its concrete manifestation, was not a complete unknown. Their surprise and disappointment must have derived from their acquaintance with a prototype of a Khalifa that existed on earth prior to the creation of Adam. This pre-Adamic Khalifa caused damage and bloodshed, and they feared that this violent history of the earth will repeat itself. Of the variety of creatures that were created prior to Adam, most commentators agree that in their reaction, the angels allude to the jinn. Similarly to the angels, the jinn were spiritual and existed long before Adam. Unlike the angels, who were celestial beings, the jinn also inhabited the earth. In a treatise called Ithbat al-Wasiyya, that is the assertion of the designation, we are introduced to one of the most elaborate early descriptions of the Nasnas role in the pre-Adamic era. This treatise aims to show a continuous sequence of religious leadership from the dawn of history until the last imam that, according to the Shi'i belief, was designated upon his father's death in 874. It starts with a famous tradition about the creation of positive and negative spiritual beings and their respective armies, And the next stage in this universal history is the creation of the jinn and the nasnas. God, we are told, created the jinn and the nasnas and made them inhabit the earth. Since they caused bloodshed, changed and altered or disobeyed God's will, he sent down to earth an army of angels that included the Satan, whose name was Azazel, and this army exterminated the jinn and the nasnas that were forced into the edges of earth, whereas Satan and his companions inhabited the civilized parts of the world. Satan used to rule the inhabitants of the world and pretend to be an angel, showing obedience outwardly while disobeying inwardly. When God wanted to create Adam, about 7,000 years following the creation of the jinn and the nasnas, and a considerable period into Satan's rule, he removed the cover from the earth and ordered the angels to look at the inhabitants of earth that he had created. It was hard for the angels to see the corruption and bloodshed upon earth, and only then God reveals in the Quran the words, "I am putting a successor on earth." The version in Ithbat al-Wasiyya goes on, adding to God's statement the following clarification: "I am putting a successor on earth who will be my proof for my creatures upon earth." The angels were nevertheless surprised and disappointed, and the text explains their reaction by ascribing to them the following words: "O God, appoint him from among us, since we do not cause damage and bloodshed on earth." God then explains what he knows better than the angels. He intends to create a creature from whose offspring the prophets and the rightly guided imams will rise. They will warn against God's punishment and direct to his obedience. God also promises to exile the nasnas and the rebellious demons away from his creation into the air and the edges of the earth. Finally, he would create a barrier between his creation and the demons and the nasnas, not allowing the offspring of his creation to see them nor be in their company. The idea that long before the creation of Adam, various creatures inhabited earth corresponds with the Shi'i perception of universal history. Despite the confusion and lack of consistency that characterizes sources dealing with the subject, in his article on the cosmogony and cosmology in 12-verse Shi'ism, Professor Amir Muezi, which was mentioned earlier, was able to reach several general observations. Of particular relevance to our present discussion is the notion that the age of the world is 50,000 years, and that it is divided into 5 cycles of 10,000 years each. During the first 10,000 years, the world was uninhabited. During the second cycle, it was populated by beings who were neither jinn nor angels nor humans. In the third, the world was again void of any sort of life, and in the fourth cycle, the jinn and the monstrous nasnas, and apparently also the angels, were created, and finally, in the fifth cycle, Adam and his descendants came into being. As often, when attempting to trace the origins of a notion in Islamic sources, it is practically impossible to determine whether it developed in response to theological difficulties of the kind we encounter in Quran 230, or if it had its roots in the collective psyche prior to the emergence of theological discourse. At any rate, resorting to the realm of myth to resolve ontological and epistemological questions has always constituted a fundamental characteristic of human conduct and is not peculiar to specific historical circumstances or religious affiliation. The projection of the obedience-disobedience pattern on the primordial past through myth-making is well known and represents a common motif in Shi'i literature. Nevertheless, the case of the nasnas is particularly interesting since its setting forms a deviation from the widespread scheme. While most traditions in this spirit refer to pre-existential time and spiritual entities, including the jinn, who although inhabiting the earth are regarded as ruhaniyun, spiritual, the story of the nasnas clearly takes place in an existential era and in material or tangible form. This has far-reaching implications. The story of Adam, which is associated with the creation of the world in its material form, and which in itself represents a cosmological myth, is no longer sufficient as the starting point of universal history. As we saw, for early commentators, some of the riddles that surround Adam's creation could not be solved unless it is set within a broader historical perspective, thus resolving the difficulties to which one myth gives rise involves its depiction as a subsequent event to an earlier mythic state of things. As we go back in time towards the origin of all these mythic stages, the complexity with which one has to deal is gradually decreased. I remind you, the fifth cycle was of mankind, the fourth jinn and nasnas, the third uninhabited, the second neither jinn nor angelic nor human, and the first uninhabited earth. Although it is nowhere stated that Adam represented an advanced stage in the chain of evolution, it is likely that early commentators arrived intuitively at the conclusion that prior to the creation of man, there must have been other primitive species on Earth. In this respect, two of the Nasnas characteristics seem to be highly relevant. First, that the inspiration for what the Nasnas is had derived from an existing species of ape or marine animal, to which I referred earlier. And second, that the Nasnas had the form of half a human being. Reflecting on the first realistic source of inspiration to the image of the Nasnas, one is inevitably reminded of modern evolutionist theories. The second fantastic idea that prior to the creation of man, God created half man could be seen as representing another fictive perception of gradual evolution. Appealing as these ideas may be, it should be stressed again that the sources never present the creation of Adam as another evolutionary step, but rather as the emergence of an entirely new species. To conclude, let us have a look at Muhammad Hussein al-Tabatabai, Al-Mizan fi Tafsir al-Quran, which is one of the most important modern Shi'i Quran commentaries from the 20th century, which is also representing a somewhat different position. In his commentary on Quran 2:30, At-Tabatabai ascribes to the angels a very rationalistic prophecy. According to him, the angels realized that life on earth, which is bound to earthly desires, could not be ruled or maintained without social order and collaboration among society's multiple members. As such, it will necessarily lead to corruption and bloodshed. Seen in this light, At-Tabatabai interprets the angels' reaction as an expression of their desire to better understand how God's successor will handle these inevitable harsh circumstances, rather than disobedience or an expression of arrogance towards God. For At-Tabatabai, the Khalifa was meant to represent God on earth, and there is no problem of deification with this view since, as is evident from the angel's perception of the Khalifa, his principal role must be to celebrate God's praise and proclaim His holiness. A role that, according to the angels, the Khalifa will not be able to perform properly only due to earthly necessities. That the angel's prediction regarding the successor's behavior was correct is further evidenced by the lack of its denial on the part of God, says At-Tabatabai. Moreover, At-Tabatabai determines that in this verse God meant to appoint his representative upon earth rather than someone who will succeed the earth's former inhabitants, the jinn or the nasnas. A view that, according to At-Tabatabai, and as shown above, some commentators thought to be likely. This conclusion, he elaborates, fits several other verses in the Quran in which God refers to human beings long after Adam as successors, khulafa. He equally argues that this conclusion corresponds to the immediate context of Quran 2:30, where God teaches Adam all the names, Quran 2:31, and for him, for Tabatabai, all the names, and in the Shia view in general, are the names of future apostles, prophets, and imams from Adam's descent. until the end of time. Tabatabai, as one sees, was clearly aware of the view held by some commentators regarding Adam's succession of pre-Adamic beings. Despite his unequivocal rejection of this view, the question remains open as to whether Tabatabai dismisses out of hand the notion that beings such as the jinn and the nasnas existed prior to the creation of Adam. Finally, although the allusion to pre-Adamic beings, mostly jinn in the context of Quran 230, is shared by both Sunni and Shi'i commentators, I was unable to find any reference to the nasnas in non-Shi'i exegetical works. This is particularly puzzling in light of the well-established place which the term occupies in medieval Arabic literature, as shown by Vigera in her article. One possible explanation may be related to the strong dualistic worldview of the Shia. The nasnas, as a prototype of disobedience par excellence, fits perfectly the dualistic message that early commentators sought to find in the Quran. As attested in a common Shia tradition, we, the Imams, are humans, our Shia are like humans, and the rest of mankind are nasnas. The nasnas, inhuman or subhuman nature, goes very well together with this view. Thank you.
Thank you, Roy. The floor is open for questions.
So thanks a lot, Roy, for this interesting lecture and introducing myth inside our study of Islam is, of course, a very welcome move. What strikes me when I read medieval commentaries, be they Sunni or Shi'is, and since I read the Quran as an historian, is how much people are able to do something extremely creative and unexpected with this text. Because honestly, it's very hard to imagine while reading the Quran that it could refer to all to what the commentators refer. One point, just to remark, it's very secondary point, but I think that Khalifa is probably closer to Viceroy or Lieutenant than to successor for many reasons. And a good point for this is that the earliest attestations of Khalifa are Khalifatullah, and Rasulullah are later, attested later than Khalifatullah, and successor of God doesn't mean much, I think. And now a simple question, there's of course a question you are led to ask when you are reading this myth of Nasnas. Why did God create this half-man or this Nasnas? Do the myths you are talking about have any answer to this simple question? Well, God created some beings during a cycle of, let's say, 10,000 years, but what for? Is it only because they were supposed to adore him like the jinns and humans are supposed to do? Or what was wrong with these creatures? If there was something wrong, how is it possible that God creates something wrong? And so on. I mean, it opens more questions than answers, I'm afraid.
Well, the way I see it, the myth of the Nasnas represents just one aspect of the human post-creation generations to explain their own existence. So, since in this particular case it was not enough to refer to Adam as the first physical being upon earth, they project the history of the world backwards, and I think this is why we find this myth in the commentary.
Yeah, but see, I do not know this text from Ibn Babuya, but what seems strange to me is the idea that the Nasnas, as a pre-Adamite people, are considered as evil in them, because the idea that Adam, so mankind, Inse or Insan is not the first cycle of creatures that received a revelation and that are even that possess a kind of rational faculty, able to understand God's commands and prescriptions. So this is a very common idea in Shi'i thought. There are even texts that say that the jinn were a community prior to the human. But there were good jinns and bad jinns. There are other texts, I will speak about this in 2 days in the Myth conference, about the Tim and the Rim and the Bin. They are mentioned also in the Druze writings, in the Sairi texts. It are pre-Adamite people. But all these people, the history of mankind was already there, is projected back even in these pre-Adamite cycles. So you had jinn, good jinn, who listened to God's commands, and others who were listening to the demonic figures. So if the Nas was a people or creature preceding mankind, why was it a principle of evil? That's
because this is the projection of what I call the obedience-disobedience pattern.
But is there also obedience in?
Yeah, there are the angels and the jinn in the same cycle, let's say.
So this means that the jinn were obedient.
Yes.
Okay.
At least part of the jinns are considered as obedient to the Lord and to let's say the archetypes of the imams, and the Nasnas represents the disobedient par excellence. So
followers of Umar. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, it's actually quite similar to what you said in your lecture, that we have to have this obedience, this binary perception of history all through. Whenever we refer to a period, whether imaginative or real, there has to be a representative of the good and evil. And the Nasnas, what I found interesting in the Nasnas is that it's a physical representation of the disobedient par excellence, as opposed to the jinn, who can be either obedient or disobedient and are spiritual in nature. The Nasnas also, to my view, is a creature, a physical creature.
Thank you, Rian. I found very interesting, like this whole idea of obedient and disobedient, and listening to yesterday's papers and today the ones that I was here. I'm also finding very interesting how, talking about demons, how much it tells us about the relationship of angels and God, and how they were like interacting. And I'm thinking to the Coptic tradition of Satan, and which relates a lot. It's a late antique. It relates a lot to the late antique cult of Archangel Michael, where there we are told that everything is fine, and God decides to make Michael his best and foremost angel. It's his archangel. And then basically Satan, who's there, and he's already like the first one, objects to it and says, but why? I'm the first one. Why is it Michael? And then God insists. Satan puts his foot down, and that's when he gets deposed, and he becomes actually Satan. And which, by the way, brings us to yesterday's point. I think in the Coptic Church, Satan is there. We don't have to wait until the Middle Ages. You have him there from late antiquity, very much active and basically objecting and being very disobedient to God and everything. So I think it's interesting, like how also like angels and their relationship to God, and how that will also might, depose you to everything. So.
Okay, we can thank Dr. Vilozny. Thank you.